Hello, hello. Good Saturday morning, people. How you going? Welcome to the stream this morning. So basically today we are going to be looking at this piece that we started last week, or we were working on last week, which was inspired by this picture that I accidentally just clicked out of when I said hello. So let me find that again. So basically, if you didn't see last week's, I was going through the internet and I found this image, this piece of digital video game architecture by Thiago Kalafki, it says here. And I just really liked the mood of it, and it inspired me to write a composition. And part of what I've been doing lately is I've been using a program called Notion by Presonus to start actually composing using sheet music, using a score. And basically my logic behind that is to start with the actual core composition, and then once I feel like that sounds good in itself and that expresses what I want to express, then we can move it to a program like FL Studio or Studio One or Ableton Live to then do more of the sound design, because it is very easy to get stuck on sound design and miss out on core melodies and harmonies and stuff like that. And I could probably very passionately talk about how a lot of soundtrack music is all about sound design these days, which isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. But think about the movies where you remember the melody, and those are the ones that really stick with you. Anyway, so just to look at what things were sounding like last week, I've just got my last stream here. So basically at this point in time, I had worked on this piece for, I think it was 3 or 4 hours. And I just written it for solo piano at this point, just to keep the instrumentation as basic as possible. But this is what it was sounding like. We'll just play a bit of it. So yeah, that's what it was sounding like for solo piano. Since then, arranged it for multiple instruments. We've got a trumpet, we've got marimba in there, we've got piano, and we've got an upright bass. So it's kind of a jazzy, small band kind of thing. And I thought that was fitting the mood of that image of that apartment. So what we'll do is we'll listen to this. You know what? We'll listen to it first, and then I'll go into it. So this is what it sounds like currently, just in Notion, using the default Notion sounds. Yeah, yeah. So that's the piece. That's the piece arranged in Notion. So that's using the default Notion sounds there, which, you know, most people would say don't ever stick to the default sounds in these things. I think these sound pretty good. We don't quite have all the little dynamics and articulations that you'd get from real players, and we'll talk about how to get that in FL Studio and other DAWs after this. But for what it is, it sounds pretty damn good. And I think maybe it's because, as I said, I'm inspired a lot by video game music. I do actually write for video games as a job. And so often when I'm composing for this, especially inspired by like a picture like the one we saw, to me, it's like a video game soundtrack or maybe a movie soundtrack. So this is playing in the background. It's kind of painting the mood and the atmosphere of the scene or the environment that you're in. So that's kind of probably why I make a lot of creative choices I do here. So anyway, just to break it down, where do we start? So in comparison to the what we had last week, where it was just piano, a lot of the bass lines you'll see here have actually been moved to the upright bass. And so if we just solo this, the upright bass, come on, we can do this. Oh, whoops. That's better. The upright bass is a bass instrument. However, it can actually be used melodically as well, which sounds pretty cool in this kind of moody, jazzy, bluesy kind of thing. So yeah, so we've got like the basic kind of blues melody sort of thing there. Yeah, so that's been moved to the bass. Throughout the rest of the track, the bass is often actually has just taken over the bottom half of the piano, or it's doing, you know, a single note to kind of thicken out the big chords, for instance here, to really give it that like bass low end, to really make it thick and impactful. I've only ever given the bass one note at once because, you know, a real player would usually play one note at once. They can do sometimes chords and cool little slides and things like that, but I'll have to learn a little bit more about the upright bass to learn what sounds realistic on it. Just another thing, actually, if you do play any of these instruments and you're looking at the score, especially if you play the trumpet and you're going, why doesn't he use the trumpet in the chorus bit? Well, that's true. If I was writing this for a real band, I would make sure that you'll get like proper equal turns and don't feel left out of the exciting bits and all that kind of thing. But just from a purely kind of sound design, digital arrangement perspective, so far I actually liked the punchy sound of the piano for the kind of chorusy bit. You know, that may still change, but could do staccato trumpet or something like that. Speaking of which, so then the piano itself has pretty much stayed the same since the last version. I think I've put in more chords, and I can't remember this time last week whether we actually had chords in the chorus or whether it was just a single melody line. But if we go back to, where's the chorus here? So I think that top line was pretty much just a single note melody, single voice, but now it's mostly chords. And that just gives it a little more epicness. There's probably been a few other minor changes here. So little bits where I put some kind of like staccato in the bass here, just this little bit, just to kind of give it that almost swell from kind of small to large, if that makes sense. yeah, so that's pretty much what the piano is doing. And then we've added the trumpet, and I'm pretty sure every single thing in the trumpet line is new. So, and it's made to... it actually follows a lot of the bass. So I wonder if I can do this. Does this work? No, I don't know how to solo just those two. But if we listen to the trumpet, it's more or less following what the bass is doing. It's a little bit different though, and that's why then you get that cool blend between them. And you can hear when they match up. Yeah. And so you get that cool sound where basically all three instruments are sort of following the same melody, but they're kind of dancing it around it individually. And so you kind of have this cool kind of weaving in and out. So probably the best example is these first three bars, because it's like they kind of start slightly apart, and then by bar 3 here, they all hit at the exact same time, and they do pretty much the same thing. And you might be able to kind of get a sense that that helps raise the tension levels from like very kind of flowy and relaxed to something punchier, which is a bit more exciting. And so in music, as you've probably heard, you're constantly kind of doing these dances between low tension and high tension, and there's so many different ways to do that, and so many different kind of emotional tools you have to express that depending on what you're trying to express. So that's probably most of what's going on here. When we get to the B section, which is like these arpeggios, this is where the marimba comes in now, and that's pretty much been taken from what was on piano, and then piano has since been given this other kind of sort of melody just to give it a bit more harmony going. And you can hear there's kind of accented stronger hits on certain hits in the marimba, and it's not actually totally kind of consistent where they lie. It's actually, the accented hits are more or less following the bass line of this part, which you can see between the marimba bass and the bass, the upright bass. So as the B section kind of slowly builds up, the piano then changes to these other kind of chords, I guess these 2-note chords that kind of go in and out. So if we just, and it's very soft, so if we just listen to this. So hopefully you can hear that. Turn up your speakers if you can't. And it's just kind of padding out what we're hearing with the marimba and giving it a bit more elegance and building it up a little bit. Because this is the part where the marimba, so this line previously was on piano, but the marimba is now doing those kind of arpeggios. Excuse me. The marimba is doing these arpeggios, but it's kind of now become a bit more melodic. There's certain notes in there that aren't just following the basic chordal arpeggio. They're hitting certain notes, so it kind of creates this sense of melody. Yeah. And then that ends off with these kind of double speed piano duets. That's the technical term. And then we have this kind of like finger roll that goes into the chorus. So, yeah. and that's just a very transitional thing there to go from soft to loud. Yeah, so we've got the chorus, which you've heard many times since the start of this stream now. Hopefully you like it. Then we go, so here now in the A2, I've called it, which is basically that intro bluesy sort of verse bit, but it's different this time around. And so if we listen to this. So again, previously this was all on piano. What's on the trumpet and the marimba were both on the piano's upper, on the right hand, on the treble clef. Bass is just more or less copying the bass of the piano. But so what I did was when I brought it out to the trumpet and marimba, on the piano, it already sounded like there were kind of two different instruments playing. And that's because this first bar, so if I just solo these, it sort of follows like an echo, but it's very rhythmically different. And so you can see that the marimba, for example, is actually using triplets and duplets. So it's slightly off the main rhythm. And because it was sounding so kind of like different, even on the piano, it was kind of obvious to put it on different instruments. And that actually reminds me, I was talking to, this was back when I was at uni, a student who was training to be a classical pianist, and he was very good. But one thing he told me, he said, when you're writing for piano, pretend you're writing for a whole orchestra. Just put it on piano. And what he meant by that is basically exactly what we're doing here, but what you would do on piano, where imagine you've got these several different voices, these several different instruments playing, but you just put them all on piano and you weave them together, and you can separate them either through register, like some being on a high note, some being on low, or through rhythm or whatever, to kind of give them this oral audio separation. And so even if people are just listening to the piano and they're going, I love this piano piece, there's almost this semi-subconscious thing that's like, this is several different voices, they would say, singing. So. And one very cool thing with that, which isn't done very clearly here, but probably more so in this first bit, is that when you have several instruments, you can have these kind of like echoes, or so you'll have like a little melody that's played on one and then maybe echoed on the other. And depending on whether you play them at the same time or whether you play them separately, like one after the other, it has a different effect. So, I mean, the closest example we have here is similar sort of movement on the trumpet and then the marimba, especially those last notes. So, da, da, da. So you might be able to hear that. It's like the same notes. So, and so originally I'd done that, and the trumpet was like, if I just get rid of this. Originally it was like this because I just copied and pasted it. And you can hear how the trumpet kind of sounds like it stops too abruptly. So what I did was I added like an extra note here, and we tied it so it kind of ties over, it keeps playing onto the next bar, and it helps blend them together. So a lot of those little things I just talked about there are all very cool techniques that you can use when you're arranging or orchestrating or taking a piece and spreading it out amongst different instruments. It offers you so much creative space. It kind of like widens the space you have to play in. So and you almost have to think about it spatially sometimes, or whatever helps you. Like you've got that instrument over there playing, and you've got that instrument over there playing. By kind of like internalizing there's a separation, it gives you this kind of creative space to kind of place things in certain places. And even though the listener may not have the technical knowledge to understand that, it's how you create these really cool textures and blends and cocktails of instruments that create a cool sound, and people just go, oh, that sounds cool, I like that. So as we move on to the second half of this A2 bit, so something I'm doing very shortly here is the marimba is actually playing just for these 2 bars quickly. It's actually playing the same thing that the piano was playing back in this B section here. And that is just a little callback for no purpose other than having callbacks and things like that, and repeating patterns in music often works quite well. It's one of those things. It's like it strengthens the emotion of it sometimes. People get to know those little patterns, and whether they realize it or not. And I mean that draws a lot from the motif techniques that are used in a lot of film scores and stuff. We'll do another whole stream on that. But basically, it's trying to reuse patterns in different ways, transforming them, putting them in new contexts. But it helps really build up the emotional attachment to them, which then makes them more emotional to your audience, and then gives them a better payoff in certain bits. So anyway, I'll let you know when we do that stream. So then we go to the D section. Oh yeah, so this repeats, goes back to the chorus, and then we go to the D section. And this almost shifts mood a bit. It becomes quite magical. This actually started out as, I think it was just this line here. Actually, no, it was these 2 lines. So you can hear it was pretty much there anyway. I think I was just playing with some rhythms using much faster, like shorter notes here. And I mean, even that in itself just creates this very nice kind of like mystical quality. And then we got kind of notes in the bass that are kind of slower, but they're kind of adding to the harmony, the layers of harmony. Now, I don't know if you recognize that, but that's actually pulled from another part of the piece as well. It's actually from the melodic bit in the B section, where the marimba, well, now marimba, it was piano at first. So that's what I'm talking about. You can take things, reuse them, and transform them. And it may seem lazy at first. You may feel that way. But you're not actually being lazy if you're doing it the right way. You're it's being strategic. You don't do it because it's easy. You do it because it works really well. And if you've ever played Undertale by Toby Fox, he does this a lot, and that's one reason people really respect his soundtrack. And like, he's not. I don't think he's musically trained. I'm pretty sure he used to learn video game music on piano, and then has since moved to FL Studio actually, and then he'll just point and click and paint in the music essentially. And uses his ears. So I don't think he has the technical knowledge to realize that he's using motifs and themes like that. But I have heard him in an interview talk about it, and he was the one that I've actually probably heard say it best, that when you put themes in different contexts and reuse them, it creates this stronger emotional attachment to them. So anyway, so that's that. Lowest bit there is stolen from previously, but you add it to the mix and it creates a blend. It also helps keep the sound more consistent as well. So even though this higher bit is quite different to everything else, because this is the same as what we've already had, it helps kind of anchor it back into the piece you're already doing. So yeah, and then so for the actual instrumentation, basically I felt that the higher bits needed to use a marimba as well, because in fact I think this was the section that actually made me decide to put a marimba in, because getting that kind of magical feeling sounded like it needed something a bit like a mallet instrument in there, pitched percussion, to give it that little kind of airy-fairy kind of high end. And then one thing that was cool while I was doing this, and I think this was partly by accident, was when I was doing the bass here. Originally the bass just followed the piano, but actually, you know what it was? It was I had copied something into the bass, but half the notes were out of range on the bass, and so it only played certain notes. And the notes that it played actually happened to sit on the ones you see now. And I heard it and I went, that's a really cool rhythm. So I ended up taking out all the other notes, which is kind of why I have these butchered kind of rests here, because that should be, what should that be? That should be like that. Oh, okay. That won't work right now. I'll do it later. So we had that rhythm, and then I added in a few other notes to kind of like keep the rhythm sounding good and having this kind of stronger first beat. And then I added in this eighth note here at the end of this bar to help lead back into that start, because without it, it was kind of just... Still sounds good, but to have that little eighth note lead in helps kind of make it a little more of a seamless loop. And I mean, and this bit is very much, it's an ostinato, as they would say. It's basically just repetitions. And for the first, I don't know how many iterations of that it is. 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8. Yeah, so there's 8 bars, but there's 4 copies of that 2-bar loop before we bring in the horn. So I'll just play this again. Yeah, so we've brought in this horn and we're not using it strongly. You can see we've got the 2 P's there, which means quite soft, pretty soft. That's not what it actually stands for, but yeah, that's what it means. The horn is being used, the trumpet is being used in a way that it's again trying to stick with the kind of magical kind of overtones of this section. So it's almost being used in a way that you'd usually use a clarinet or something like that in an orchestrated piece. But keeping it with a trumpet, again, it helps keep it in the same kind of mood of the piece. Even though we're kind of departed from that original bluesy mood, we're now in this magical section. But that's why we have these long, drawn-out notes. And you can see, like, when we get here, the rhythms that's following, it's almost in itself changed time signature to a 3/4 here. We're using a lot of these quarter and a half notes. And these ties are pretty much doing that same thing, but just across these central beats here. So it would be easier to read for someone to play. By the way, I should say, if we do have any trumpeters or anyone else who intends to play this piece, and you do want to play it for your instrument, reach out to me, because currently what we're looking at is concert pitch, not the actual like proper transposed. Yeah, so you can see the trumpet actually would look different on your sheet music. So anyway, reach out to me if you want it, and I'll give you like the version that you can read for your actual instrument. But yeah, so you've almost got the trumpet on its own kind of rhythm against everything else, which is kind of helping it do that kind of like weave in and out kind of thing, which gives it a little more of that magical feeling as well. And you'll see then the trumpet transitions down here. So what's happened here is that we've gone, where are we? So what we're hearing now is, apart from the trumpet, is actually just this B section again. But if we come back to here, where's because basically the intention was to go back to this B section and then back to the C section, the chorus again, to kind of complete the loop of intensity and make it sound good. But it's cool because we've got this B section again. We've heard it, we're used to it, and we're hopefully at the point where it's sounding good to us after hearing it 2 or 3 times. But now you've got the new trumpet part over the top, which is giving it this magical overtone to this otherwise mysterious kind of crime scene thriller music that was happening before. And so it's like it's shining a new light on what we've already heard. And it also helps seamlessly transition between these 2 sections. And then it fades out, and then we're kind of back to where we were, or back to how we remember it anyway. Yeah. So, and we're back to the chorus, which sounds good. Yeah, so I think I said last week, while I've been writing this, I've almost imagined it in like one of the Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney games or something like that. So kind of setting the scene for a kind of crime thriller game, or possibly movie, but probably more game, where you're in these apartments. And so last time it was called Night Apartments, and I've since given it a more specific name called 23B Walker Street, which, if that's your address, I just picked a name there that sounded legit, so it's not saying anything about a crime scene at your house. But yeah, so this is kind of a would-be video game soundtrack for that. If you have any questions, please post them on the YouTube, and in fact, I will just see if what we're getting here. So, yep, no, that's cool. So, given all that, then we will move to the next section, which is basically I've taken this and put it into FL Studio, which you can see here. And this isn't finished yet, but the whole reason behind this is that it's basically to try and make the instrument sound more realistic, B, to be able to customize the instruments a bit. So now this so far actually sounds sort of quite different, but we'll just give it a quick listen and then I'll break it down a little bit. if we just skip forward to the kind of more magical bit. Yeah, so that's what it's sounding now. It's actually sounding more subdued, and I'm still working on this and tweaking all the instruments and building them up and stuff like that. I haven't decided which one I actually prefer yet, to be honest. But this one sounds hopefully more like it's being played by real people. And part of that is that when you're using notation software like this, it's great. And like I said, the Notion 6 sounds, default sounds sound great. But there are VSTs or virtual instruments out there, which basically are built to have a more human sound. And I haven't done this yet here, but if we just look at this trumpet line, so just to show the trumpet, so I'm using East-West Quantum Leap. I've got the Composer Cloud, so I get access to all of them. But Hollywood, no, what are we looking at? The trumpet. Should not be the strings. It's not the strings, it's the trumpet. It's from the Hollywood Brass, that's right. Sorry, it was just on the wrong browser menu. So Hollywood Brass, solo trumpet. And then I've got it on the key switch, sus short, sustained short. And key switches I'll talk about in just a sec, actually. So if we listen to just the trumpet by itself here. So already it's a little more expressive than the one we had here, which was like... But using key switches, what we can actually do is switch between these different kind of articulations and dynamics and stuff like that. Something like that is probably the main reason you would put it into a digital audio workstation and then kind of make it sound more human from there. So I'll just press some of these blue keys, which are the key switches here, and you should be able to hear how the sound of the trumpet changes. So obviously that sounded pretty horrible, but but it showed you. So we've got all these different expressions that we can kind of add more character and more expressiveness to the melodies we do here. And it's probably worth just taking a moment to talk about, making music on computer versus, real instrumentalists. This is one reason that we're still need real musicians, and we'll probably always need real musicians because computers can't really touch the expressiveness of a real professional player yet. Obviously we've got things like this where you can simulate it, but it's still to get it sounding really flowing and stuff like that. Don't worry, if you're a professional player, you're still needed. Also, just a side fact, people tend to love real human players as well. That's why you can get like 1 million views on a pianist playing piano in an airport somewhere, phoned on real crappy quality phone microphone, and they'll listen to it and they go, this is beautiful. Because often when people listen to music, they're trying to listen to kind of the human expression behind it. What's the message behind it? And that then can go into the discussion about how much the context of music changes the way we experience it, how much our understanding of the musician changes the way we experience it. If you think of your favorite artists, often you respect them as people as well. And if you don't respect them as people, often you find it hard to enjoy their music. All sorts of things. But anyway. So what I'm attempting to do though is to humanize this as much as possible. And so I've got the trumpet and everything else in this digital audio workstation. And I'll just show you a few other things here that I'm doing. So the trumpet is just a trumpet. The piano, now I'll show you this cool new toy that I got this week that I really, really, really like. It's a plugin called Ascend by Heaviosity, who I've just started looking into more this week, and I am very impressed with their sound design tools. So basically, Ascend is a virtual instrument which is made up of recordings from a grand piano, but they haven't just recorded the people playing the keys themselves. They've also recorded basically soft keys, muted keys, muted strings, sorry, and like all sorts of other things. Like, so if I go here, put the chain, so this is, I believe it's a chain being run over the strings of a piano. Or like a piece of twine. And you've got all these fantastic textures for a range of emotions just from a piano. And the great thing about being a digital instrument is that the people down at Heaviosity have done a great job, and they've added all this functionality where you can blend between them. So I should just say this isn't a product placement. Like, I genuinely got this week, and I'm so thrilled to be using it. So if I put this back on, muted? And actually, if I re-enable my automations here, you can see what's actually happening to this virtual piano. And so I've got these three kind of sound samples here, or these three versions of the piano. You've got the muted strings, you've got the very soft kind of piano, and then you've got the large piano, the hard played piano. So we start off with the very soft strings. Very soft, normally played piano. And then as we're going into that B section, gradually changing the sound from the soft piano to the muted strings. So you can hear, once we get to these kind of like repeating chords and in the arpeggio section, it's become a shorter, kind of pluckier sound as opposed to your drawn out piano sound. And then we go to the chorus, and it goes to your heavily played piano. And so doing things like this, and I mean, it's not just this instrument, you can do it with any instrument. And this is another great thing about using a audio workstation after composition, is things like automation. You can move the sound design and the textures in ways that add to the expression of it all. You've got the melodies and the harmonies expressing stuff, and then you've got the dynamics expressing stuff, and then now we've got the actual sound design layers expressing stuff as well. So the idea is that you're using all these tools to kind of express what you're trying to express, or paint the picture that you're trying to paint. So if we go back to the magical section then, Sounds cool. And look, I might still change this because if I go to another template here, which is this one I've slightly changed version of Punchy Plucker, which is one of the default ones. Jade is just John, my name. Will sound like this. I can even automate here, which I'll just do. So over 2 bars, it's going to move around, which we can see here. Yeah, and so it's given it like an extra ethereal quality there. So, yeah. So here, if I'll just go back to the one that I had, hopefully that sounds the same. Yeah, cool. So the piano is currently made up of that. If we look at the upright bass, so we've got the upright bass just from. Here, where are we? Just from East-West Quantum Leap. And which sounds good in itself and gives it the sound of an upright bass, which is what we want. And then because, I'm loving Ascend at the moment, I added that plucky sound as well. But the plucky sound of the muted strings. But I think I raised it here an octave. Oh no, I didn't. Sorry, I was going to, but it's the same. And yeah, so and this is just to give that kind of like plucky sound to the bass itself. So together it sounds like this. Yeah, and so the theory behind what I'm doing in a lot of this stuff is I've composed for certain instruments, which is good because it helps kind of place them in the band or in the orchestra or whatever you want. And then from there, I'm adding some sound design elements to kind of tweak them in new ways and kind of make them sound a little different to what they would otherwise sound like. And this just adds that kind of one slight step removed from watching a real performance. And so this is one area that digital composition really shines, is that you have complete control over the sounds of instruments, and you can use instruments that don't even exist in the real physical world. But yeah, it's one of these things where I believe that people do prefer the sound of real instruments, and that's one reason actually I'm using like a piano sort of thing to add to the sound rather than a synthesizer, because personally, and I think a lot of people do prefer the sound of like real instruments. But I have heard several composers and producers talk about how sometimes one way to go when you're producing on computer is to not try and make things sound completely as human as possible, but to use these human sounds, but then use the computer in ways that only a computer can do. So there's a composer, Hitoshi Sakimoto, who did the Final Fantasy XII soundtrack, and I think it was Vagrant Story or Vagrant Chronicles. I can't remember what it's called. Final Fantasy Tactics. And when he did the Final Fantasy XII soundtrack, when he was asked, how do you get a distinct sound like he does for orchestras? He basically said he writes for computers playing orchestras, and he doesn't write for people playing orchestras, which basically means that he could probably make instruments play in ranges outside of their real range, and he could probably make instruments play faster than people could play them in real life. And he's not limited by how many players he has and things like that. So where you would think that would lose the human sound and touch, it gains the abilities that the computer allows him to do. So funnily enough, though, because Final Fantasy XII was so successful, they've since remade it, and I'm pretty sure they since re-recorded like the soundtrack by a real orchestra for the new version. So he wasn't too far removed, obviously, and I think his music always sounds quite human anyway. So each to their own. All right, what else do we have here? The marimba. So the marimba is, if we just look at that. So again, we've got the play, we've got the marimba from East West, was it Symphonic Orchestra Gold Complete? And then we've got, again, Ascend. I'm trying to get good at using this. Treating it like its own instrument. Get good at it. So just the marimba. Which sounds cool, but, just to give it a bit more of that high end. It's kind of got that. Now, you don't necessarily have to give everything all high end and low end, and I may actually still change this to kind of keep the different instruments in different frequency ranges as well, rather than every instrument across the spectrum, because then they can start to fight a bit. But yeah, it's just playing with sound design now. So yeah, how are we going for time? 4 minutes. All right, let's just see how we're doing here. Tim Oestmann sounding more dynamic in the FL Studio version. Yeah, cool. That's good to hear. That's the aim. That's the aim. I think it's hard to know because I spent so much time with this version in Notion that I think I really learnt to like it. So I'm almost going to have to trust other people's ears on this one. Probably the other thing as well is, depending on what you're composing for. So if I was to do this for, again, talking about Phoenix Wright, which was a Nintendo DS game, if I want to emulate that style, something like this, where it's not completely realistic and it sounds more obviously like recorded sounds that are played over and over, it might actually sound more appropriate if you're trying to give the sense of a video game from that era. A lot of sound and the sounds you choose kind of communicate this context of what is the world that we're in. And this works both in the fictional world, but also what is the world that the video game kind of resides in. So something like this would probably sound more appropriate on a Nintendo DS, whereas something like this would probably sound more appropriate on a modern console or a PC, possibly even like a PC indie game or something like that, where maybe I've seen a few indie games where it's like kind of 8-bit 2D graphics, but then you have this realistic sounding soundtrack in the background. You always want to err on sounding more realistic than less. But again, it depends on what you're doing. Cool. We've got 1 minute left. That's pretty much finished. I guess the last thing I could say, so I've got automations here moving the piano from different sound samples. If we just look at the mixer here, I've got all my instruments pretty much clean. The trumpet's got a little bit of reverb on it, because without it, actually, we've got 2 reverbs here. So this is what it was sounding like. Still sounds pretty good, but the trumpet was kind of sounding like it's in a different room to the other instruments. So the trumpet needed a little bit of reverb, so I've just added some very light reverb there. And then all the instruments go to this instrument bus, and I've put some very light reverb on there as well, which is why everything sounds a little more muted and slow and flowy in this version. But it also sounds like they're all kind of being played in the same room, which is another thing you want to do to try and make it sound more legit. All right, so that's 11 o'clock. Thank you for joining me today, guys. I hope you learnt something here. If you have any questions, comments, conspiracy theories, whatever you want, throw them in the comments and I'll check them out. Otherwise, you can follow John Oestmann Music on Facebook or on Twitter to get updates throughout the week and see some of the other projects that I've been working on, video games, some YouTube channels, things like that. Otherwise, you guys have a great week. Hope you can find something musical to play with, experiment with, explore. And otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.